Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. Every morning I wake up to the same silence. The kind that doesn't comfort you, it just reminds you who's no longer there. My name is George Whitman. I'm 68 years old, and I've been retired for almost a decade. My wife Helen passed away 3 years ago, and ever since the house in Boulder has been too big, too quiet, too full of memories that echo back at me. I make my coffee the same way every morning, black, no sugar, 2 ice cubes to cool it just enough. Then I sit by the window watching the mountains turn gold under the first light. Helen used to love that view. My son Ethan doesn't come around much anymore. He says he's busy work meetings, deals the usual script. I stopped believing that months ago. When Helen was still alive, we used to host small dinners on Sundays. Ethan and his wife Melissa would come over, bringing a bottle of wine and stories from the city. The table would be loud with laughter, even if half of it came from Helen's side of the conversation. After she passed, those dinners stopped. At first, Ethan called every week, then every month. Now I only hear from him when there's a reason, and that reason usually has a $sign attached to it. The house feels like a museum sometimes. Her perfume still lingers in the hallway. Her gardening gloves hang by the back door, stiff from disuse. I tried to keep the place just as she left it, not out of sentimentality, but out of fear that if I change too much, she'll disappear completely. So I keep the roses trimmed the way she liked them, even though my knees protest every time I bend down. I dust her old piano, though I never learned to play. It's strange how grief turns into ritual. It gives you something to hold on to, even when it hurts. Ethan and I were never close the way Helen wanted us to be. He took after her, charming, ambitious, never content with good enough. I was the opposite. I believed in stability and steady work and quiet evenings. That difference didn't matter when he was young. Back then we built tree houses and fixed bikes in the garage. But somewhere along the way, ambition built a wall between us. Ethan wanted skyscrapers. I was content with blueprints. Melissa came into the picture about 10 years ago. Pretty polished, the kind of woman who knew which fork to use for salad and how to turn small talk into social climbing. She worked in marketing, always dressed like she was about to walk into a magazine cover. Helen tried hard to like her, but I could see the strain in her smile. Melissa wasn't cruel, not exactly just dismissive in the way people are when they think they've already met their equals and everyone else is background noise. After they got married, Ethan's visits became shorter. He started using words like brand value ROI and market exposure. I understood numbers, but not the kind he was talking about. Whenever I asked how his job was going, he'd answer with buzzwords instead of feelings. He wasn't talking to his father anymore, he was presenting to an audience. Melissa would nod approvingly beside him. I learned to stop asking. Still, I tried to help when he needed it. 2 years ago, he called asking for a small loan. Just a temporary setback, Dad. A client pulled out, and we need to cover payroll until the next quarter. He promised to pay it back. He didn't. I didn't remind him either. What good would it do? I'd rather lose a few thousand than lose whatever thin line of connection we still had. That's what parents tell themselves, that silence is love, that endurance is wisdom. Maybe it's just fear of finality. The days all blur together now. Coffee at 7, garden work at 8, a walk down the block if the weather's kind. Sometimes I stop by the community library, return the same books I've already read. The librarian, a kind young woman named Jenny, always asks, "How's your son?" I give her the same polite smile and the same answer, "He's doing well." I don't tell her that I have no idea if that's true. Last Tuesday, I found myself in the attic sorting through old boxes. Helen had labeled everything neatly: Ethan's drawings, summer 1985 wedding photos. Beneath a pile of old documents, I discovered a letter from an investment firm. It was addressed to me, postmarked 3 weeks ago. I opened it absent-mindedly, expecting another pension statement. Instead, it congratulated me for the maturity of my long-term employee investment fund, one I had completely forgotten about from my engineering days at B&L Energy. The payout, after all these years, amounted to just over $100,000. I had to read the number twice. 100,000. I laughed, a short, surprised sound that felt foreign in my own throat. Not that it would change my life. I lived simply my needs small. Still, I imagined Helen teasing me, saying, "Now you can finally fix that roof without pretending duct tape is a solution." She always said money only mattered when you used it to make something better. That's what I plan to do. Repair the house, maybe set up a small scholarship for engineering students in her name. Something that would last longer than me. That evening, I sat by the fireplace with the letter in hand, staring at Helen's picture on the mantel. The light flickered across her face, caught the curve of her smile. "Well, darling," I murmured. "Looks like your old fool of a husband got lucky." The sound of my own voice startled me. I hadn't spoken aloud in the house for hours. For the first time in months, I felt a quiet kind of joy, the kind that doesn't shout but hums softly in your chest. I poured myself a small glass of bourbon, raised it to the photo, and said, "To us." It was silly sentimental, but it felt right. I went to bed that night thinking maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning around. The next morning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter as I brewed coffee. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name appear, Ethan. It was the first time he'd called in months. My stomach tightened. I hesitated before answering, wondering what he needed this time. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone too casual to be casual. "Heard the big news about the money?" I froze the cup halfway to my lips. "What money?" I asked, though I already knew. There was a pause on the line long enough for me to picture the smirk forming on his face. "Come on, Dad, don't play dumb. Melissa's friend works at B&L's accounting office. Word travels fast. Congrats on the jackpot. 100 grand, huh?" He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "So, what are you planning to do with it?" I didn't answer right away. Outside, the mountains glowed under the morning sun, their peaks sharp against the pale sky. I thought of Helen's voice, soft but firm, echoing in my head. "Be careful who you share your blessings with, George." "Nothing yet," I said finally. "Haven't decided." Ethan laughed again, lighter this time, but still wrong. "Well, maybe I can help you decide. We should talk about investing, you know. Make sure it doesn't just sit there collecting dust." Something in me shifted. Then a warning, quiet but unmistakable. I set the cup down and said, "We'll see, son. Let's talk another time." As I hung up, I stared at the phone screen, at his name fading into black. The warmth from the coffee had already gone cold. I stood there for a long moment, watching the steam curl and vanish. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt a chill run through me. Outside, a gust of wind swept through the garden, scattering dry leaves across the porch. I looked at the letter from the investment firm lying on the table and thought about how strange it was, how something as small as a number on a page could change the entire balance of a family. I didn't know it yet, but that call was the beginning of the storm. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The mountains outside the window were shrouded in fog, the kind that seemed to press against the glass like a warning. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, half reading the newspaper, trying not to think about Ethan's call. But the words kept echoing in my head. Heard the big news. About the money. I told myself I was imagining things that he'd meant well. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe. By noon, the sound of tires crunching on gravel snapped me from my thoughts. I looked out the window and saw Ethan's silver sedan pulling into the driveway. My stomach tightened. Melissa stepped out on the passenger side holding a pie wrapped neatly in foil she never baked. The last time she'd brought a pie, it was store-bought and still had the supermarket label on the bottom. They smiled as they approached the door. Smiles too bright, too practiced. I didn't have time to prepare myself before the knock came. Dad Ethan's voice was cheerful, too much so. "We thought we'd surprise you." I opened the door and stepped aside, forcing a polite smile. "That's a first?" Melissa laughed softly as she brushed past me, her perfume filling the air. "We figured it was about time we visited. It's been too long." She placed the pie on the counter, adjusting her coat with a motion that said she was already in charge of the space. "I made your favorite apple cinnamon." "Thank you," I said, though I doubted it had ever seen her kitchen. Ethan sat at the table looking around as if he was inspecting the house. "You've kept it the same, huh? Still feels like Mom. That's the idea," I said. "Coffee, sure," he replied, his tone light. We actually wanted to talk. I poured 3 cups and took my seat opposite them. The moment stretched. Melissa leaned forward, elbows on the table, and smiled with that tight, polished expression that never reached her eyes. "George, we heard about your good fortune," she began. "Congratulations. You must feel relieved, right?" I sipped my coffee. "Relieved, well," she said with a laugh. "Having that kind of money come through, it changes things. Gives you more options." Ethan nodded quickly, like a salesman backing his partner's pitch. "Yeah, Dad. 100 grand, that's nothing to sneeze at. I was thinking maybe we could help you figure out what to do with it." "I didn't realize I needed help," I said evenly. Melissa tilted her head, her voice syrupy. "Of course not, but it's a lot to manage. Investments, taxes, interest rates. It's easy to make mistakes. You shouldn't have to stress about it." "I'm not stressed," I said. "I've handled my finances for almost 70 years. There was a small silence. Ethan cleared his throat. "I just think we could open a joint account. You know, something simple, safer than keeping it sitting in the bank." He said it like he was talking to a client, rehearsed, persuasive, impersonal. Melissa jumped in again, all smiles. "Exactly. We'd manage it together as a family. You wouldn't have to worry about paperwork or scammers. It'd be in good hands." I stared at them both for a moment. They couldn't even hear how rehearsed they sounded. "And whose hands would those be?" I asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Ours, of course. I mean, we're family." "Yes," I said slowly. "We are." Melissa placed her manicured hand over mine, her smile widening. "You've been alone too long, George. Let us take care of you. It's what family's for." I looked at her hand, soft, perfect, artificial, and gently pulled mine away. "I can take care of myself just fine." She withdrew her hand and smoothed her blouse, the smile never fading, but her eyes flashing irritation. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, we're just trying to help. You've got that big house, the repairs, property taxes. It's a lot. Maybe it's time to think about simplifying." "Simplifying?" I asked. "Selling the house," he said, as if it were obvious. "You could move closer to us. We'd find you a nice condo. Melissa's cousin's in real estate. She could get a great deal." Melissa nodded eagerly. "Yes, something modern, convenient. No stairs. You could put the sale money and that 100 grand together, really make it work for you." I felt something harden in my chest. "And by work for me, you mean work for you?" Ethan frowned. "Come on, Dad. Don't make it sound like that. We just want what's best for you." "What's best for me," I said quietly, "has never been on your list of priorities." Melissa's smile finally faltered. "That's unfair." "No," I said, "that's honest." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. I could almost hear Helen's voice in my head, calm, patient, disappointed. "Money only reveals who people really are." She'd said that once after a family argument about inheritance. I never thought I'd see the truth of it in my own son. Ethan leaned forward, frustration creeping into his tone. "You're being stubborn, Dad. You've got all this money and no idea what to do with it. We're offering to help you use it wisely." "I already know what to do with it," I said. "I plan to fix the house. The rest will go to a scholarship fund. For young engineers." Ethan blinked. "You're giving it away?" "It's not giving away," I replied. "It's giving forward." Melissa scoffed softly under her breath, then smiled again when I looked at her. "That's very noble, George. But don't you think it's a bit naive? You could do so much more with that money if you thought strategically." "I've lived my whole life strategically," I said, standing up. "And I learned that strategy without heart is just greed with better manners." Her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan stood too, his voice rising. "You're twisting this into something ugly. We're your family. We're trying to help." I met his eyes. "Trust isn't something you demand, Ethan. It's something you earn." He looked away, jaw tight. Melissa gathered her purse. "I think we should go," she said coolly. "Clearly, this isn't a good time." Ethan hesitated, glancing at me, perhaps hoping I'd stop them, apologize, soften. I didn't. He sighed, muttered something about calling later, and followed her out. The door closed with a sharp click that echoed through the empty house. The silence returned heavier than before. I stood there staring at the door, the faint scent of Melissa's perfume lingering like smoke. The pie sat untouched on the counter, gleaming under the kitchen light. I took it, carried it to the trash, and dropped it in without a word. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the dry leaves in the garden. I walked to the window, watching the branches sway against the dimming sky. My reflection looked older, somehow more tired, but also clearer. Helen's photo sat on the shelf nearby. I picked it up and traced the edge of the frame with my thumb. "You were right," I murmured. "Money doesn't change people. It just shows who they've been all along." I poured myself another cup of coffee, now lukewarm, and sat back down at the table. The clock ticked steadily, unbothered by human foolishness. I thought of Ethan's eyes, bright, restless, the same as when he was a boy trying to prove himself. Somewhere along the way, he'd started measuring worth in numbers, not values. I didn't know when that shift happened. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I'd taught him to chase stability so hard he mistook greed for security. The phone buzzed again later that night. I almost didn't check, but curiosity won. 2 new voicemails. I pressed play. The first was Ethan's voice, tired and careful. "Hey, Dad. Sorry if we came off too strong today. Melissa just wants to make sure you're okay. Call me back, all right?" The second was Melissa's voice, smooth, controlled. "George, we looked into some investment options for you. A couple of them have great returns. Let's talk tomorrow." I deleted both before they finished. The phone screen went dark in my hand. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mountains, distant but certain. The rain hadn't started yet, but I could smell it coming. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind against the windows. It was strange how people could smell money faster than rain. It was barely noon when the sound of knocking startled me out of a quiet morning. I hadn't expected anyone. The fog still hung low over the mountains, and the air was heavy with the scent of rain. I wiped my hands on a towel, went to the door, and there they were, again. Ethan and Melissa standing side by side with that same brittle politeness. No pie this time, no fake smiles. Just tight lips and eyes that said they were here on business. "Dad," Ethan said, stepping inside before I could answer. "We need to talk," Melissa followed, clutching a sleek tablet and a folder of printed documents. She was dressed too sharply for a casual visit. Hair, immaculate, perfume, expensive, voice soft but commanding. "We didn't want to bother you by phone," she said smoothly. "We thought face-to-face would be better." "For what?" I asked, closing the door behind them. "For your financial future," she replied, setting her things on the kitchen table like a lawyer about to start a negotiation. "Ethan and I have been thinking. We can help you manage your money so you don't have to worry about a thing." I let out a slow breath. "You two seem awfully worried about my money lately." Ethan looked offended. "Dad, come on. We're just trying to help. It's not safe for you to handle this alone. You don't understand how fast markets change now." "I understand enough," I said. "I've lived through 7 recessions. I survived without a consultant then, and I'll survive now." Melissa offered a thin smile. "George, no one's questioning your intelligence. But times are different. You're older. You shouldn't have to deal with all this complexity." "Older doesn't mean helpless," I said. "And complexity isn't always an excuse to interfere." The air thickened. Melissa tapped her tablet, bringing up a chart. "We were thinking of creating a family investment account. You, Ethan, and I as co-owners. That way you stay involved, but we make sure everything's protected, diversified, safe." "And who controls it?" I asked. She blinked. "Well, technically all of us, but Ethan would handle the transactions since he's younger," I interrupted. "Since he's better connected," she corrected, her smile stiffening. "It's a win-win." Ethan folded his arms. "Why do you always assume the worst, Dad? You act like we're trying to rob you." "I'm not assuming anything," I said evenly. "But you've both mentioned this help 3 times now. And you keep saying we, when what you really mean is you." He sighed, frustrated. "You're being paranoid. We just want what's best for you." "What's best for me," I said quietly, "is not to be treated like a client who can't read his own bank statement." Melissa frowned. "You're making this difficult." "I didn't realize it was a transaction," I replied. The silence stretched. Rain began tapping softly against the kitchen window. I could hear the clock ticking louder with each second. Ethan shifted his weight and finally said, "Fine, forget the investments. But at least think about selling the house. You're alone here, Dad. It's too much space for one person." I felt my chest tighten. "This is the home your mother built with me. Every brick, every plant outside, she touched all of it." "I know," he said quickly, "but she's gone. You can't live in a museum. We could find you a smaller place closer to us. Melissa's cousin's in real estate. She can handle everything." Melissa smiled again, sensing victory. "Yes, we already have a few options. Modern condos, low maintenance, lots of natural light." I stood slowly. "You've already looked?" "Just in case," she said lightly. "We're thinking ahead." I stared at them both. "You've been planning this since the day you heard about the money, haven't you?" Ethan's expression hardened. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I asked. "You come here uninvited, talk about selling my home, managing my money, and you think I'm being unfair." He slammed his hand on the table, making the teacup rattle. "You always do this. You twist everything like I'm the bad guy. You can't even trust your own son." "I trusted you plenty," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I paid your tuition, helped you buy your first car, covered your debt when your startup failed. I never asked for a cent back." He glared at me, breathing hard. "That's not trust, that's control. You made sure I always owed you." I felt the words hit me like a slap. That's what you think? That helping you is a way to control you? Melissa stepped in, her tone falsely calm. George, maybe you don't realize it, but you've always tried to run his life. Even now you're clinging to this money like it's your last bit of power. I turned to her. My power, I said slowly. You mean my independence, the right to decide what's mine. You've had that luxury your whole life, Melissa. Don't preach it to me. Her face hardened, the mask slipping. You don't have to get defensive. We're offering you family, support. Family doesn't come with contracts and clauses, I said. And support doesn't come with signatures. Ethan pushed his chair back, eyes dark. You know what your problem is? You think you're the only one who ever sacrificed anything. You think you're some moral compass? But you're just a stubborn old man too proud to accept help. I met his gaze. Better stubborn than greedy. He stepped closer. Greedy, he snapped. You're calling me greedy? You've got more money than you'll ever spend, and you're hoarding it like a dragon. You don't trust anyone, not even me. Because trust is earned, I said softly. And lately, you've been spending it faster than I can replenish it. The last bit of restraint snapped. Ethan's voice rose to a shout. You're too greedy, Dad? You don't even need that money. You just don't want anyone else to have it? The words cut through me sharp and cold. For a man who'd spent his life living honestly, providing saving, being called greedy by his own son was worse than any insult. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned away, walking toward the hallway. Where are you going? He demanded. Out, I said. Out. That's it. You're walking away again. He laughed bitterly. Typical. Melissa stood, her voice sharp. Maybe he should go, Ethan. Maybe it's better this way. He hesitated, then spat the words I would never forget. Yeah, maybe you should. Get out, Dad. If you can't trust us, then maybe you don't belong here. The house went silent. Even the rain seemed to pause. I looked at my son, his face flushed, his eyes hard, and felt something inside me fracture. There was no anger left, only exhaustion. All right, I said quietly. You won't have to worry about me being in your way. I took my coat from the back of the chair. The teacup that Helen once used was still on the table, tipped over a small puddle of tea spreading slowly across the wood. I placed the cup upright, grabbed my keys, and walked to the door. No one moved to stop me. At the doorway, I turned once, looking at the picture hanging on the wall. Ethan as a boy sitting on my shoulders, both of us laughing. You don't have to worry, son, I said. You'll never have to see my greed again. Melissa looked down. Ethan's mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The sound was final, like a nail sealing a coffin. The rain had started thin and cold, soaking my shoulders as I crossed the porch. I didn't bother to run. My car waited at the curb, old but reliable, the same one Helen and I had driven up the mountain roads in summers past. I sat behind the wheel, my hands trembling slightly as I turned the key. Through the window, I saw the faint light inside the house, two figures moving in silence. One of them, my son, stood at the window, but when I looked his way, he turned and walked out of sight. I backed out of the driveway, slowly, headlights cutting through the rain. For a while, I just drove. No destination, no thought beyond the sound of the wipers scraping across the glass. The words echoed in my mind. Get out, you're too greedy. I almost laughed. After 68 years of living within my means of building, saving, and sacrificing, this was what it came down to: greed. The rain thickened, blurring the road ahead. I pulled over near a lookout point where the valley lights shimmered below. The same place Helen and I had watched the 4th of July fireworks from 20 years ago. I turned off the engine, leaned back, and let the silence fill the car. The anger never came, only a hollow ache, deep and quiet. I stared out into the night, the rain streaking down the windshield, and whispered to the darkness, "I hope you're proud of him, Helen. He's everything we raised him to be, and nothing I recognize." I stayed there for a long time, the world outside washed in silver and gray. Somewhere down in the valley, thunder rumbled softly. The rain kept falling, washing the streets clean, but some stains don't come off that easily. The rain followed me out of town like a shadow that refused to fade. It came down in sheets, hammering the roof of the car as I drove with no direction, no plan, just the instinct to keep moving. The wipers squealed across the windshield, fighting to clear the view, but the road blurred anyway. My thoughts were louder than the storm. Ethan's words echoed in the car, sharp and unrelenting. "You're too greedy, Dad. Get out." I gripped the wheel tighter until my knuckles went white. After all these years, after everything I'd given him, that was what I was worth. The highway stretched empty ahead of me, slick and gleaming under the orange streetlights. Boulder disappeared behind a curtain of rain. I didn't know where I was heading until I saw the dim flicker of a neon sign up ahead, Mountain View Diner, open 24 hours. I remembered that place. Helen and I had stopped there a dozen times on our weekend drives. Her laughter filling the car, her hand on mine as we talked about everything and nothing. I hadn't been there since she passed. Now, the same sign blinked in and out, like a ghost waving me in. I pulled into the parking lot, killed the engine, and sat in the quiet hum of cooling metal. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. Eyes sunken, jaw tight, the kind of face that had seen too much and said too little. When the rain eased to a drizzle, I stepped out, letting the cold air sting my skin. Inside the diner was almost empty. Just a trucker hunched over a plate of pancakes and a waitress wiping down the counter. The bell above the door gave a tired jingle. "Take any seat you like, honey," the waitress said, without looking up. Her voice carried that worn-out kindness of someone who'd seen too many lonely souls at midnight. I sat in a booth by the window. The vinyl cracked under my weight. I ordered a coffee black, and she brought it over a few minutes later. When she set it down, she squinted at me. "You've been here before, haven't you? Years ago? With your wife, maybe?" Her words hit harder than I expected. "Yeah," I said quietly. "With Helen." She had that pretty laugh, the waitress said softly. "Always ordered the cherry pie." I smiled faintly, the kind that hurts more than it comforts. "That was her," I said. "Cherry pie and too much coffee." The waitress patted the table and walked away. I stared out the rain-speckled window, the reflection of the neon sign trembling across my coffee's surface. The smell of fried eggs and burnt toast lingered in the air, but I wasn't hungry. I just sat there listening to the hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. Maybe Ethan was right about one thing. Maybe I was stubborn. Maybe I'd been too proud, too set in my ways to meet him halfway. But pride wasn't greed. Pride was the only thing I had left. I'd spent my whole life building things that lasted: a home, a career, a marriage. And somehow, in one night, it all felt dismantled. Helen would have known what to say. She always did. She'd bridge the gap between Ethan and me with a joke, a gentle reminder, a smile that could calm any storm. Without her, it was just two men shouting across an empty room, both too proud to bend. The waitress came by again. "You want a refill?" "Sure," I said, though I hadn't touched the first cup. She poured, then paused. "Rough night?" "Something like that." "Well," she said with a knowing nod, "coffee won't fix much, but it keeps you company." I gave her a tired smile. "That's all I need tonight." When I left the diner, the rain had thinned to mist. The road leading north shimmered under the headlights. Somewhere in my chest, a small voice whispered that I wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. Home didn't feel like home anymore. My mind drifted to the old cabin near Estes Park, the one Helen and I used to visit when we needed a break from the world. It had been years since I'd gone there, but I knew every turn of the mountain road by heart. I started the car and headed that way. The drive took nearly an hour, winding through dark woods and empty stretches of highway. By the time I reached the cabin, the rain had stopped completely. The night was still, the air cold and clean. I stepped out of the car, my shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. The cabin stood like a shadow against the trees, the porch sagging a little more than I remembered. I unlocked the door, and the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, the air smelled of dust and pine. The furniture was covered with old sheets. I turned on the lantern hanging near the doorway, its weak yellow glow revealing cobwebs and forgotten tools. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I lit the fireplace, crouching close until the flames caught, then sat back in the old armchair by the window. For the first time all night, I didn't feel the need to move. The fire crackled, throwing long shadows across the walls. I looked at the framed photo on the mantel, Helen in her garden, smiling sun in her hair. I hadn't even realized I'd brought it from the house. Maybe I'd taken it without thinking. Maybe I just couldn't leave her behind again. I did everything I could, Helen, I said softly. Everything. The flames flickered, and for a second it almost felt like she was there, her warmth, her quiet reassurance. But the room stayed empty. I took off my wet jacket, hung it on a hook by the door, and sat back down. The exhaustion hit me all at once, heavy and final. I thought about Ethan, about Melissa, about the look in his eyes when he said, "Get out." Not anger, not pain, just something hollow. Something that told me he'd been slipping away for years and I hadn't noticed. Maybe that was the real tragedy, not the argument, but all the silence that came before it. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the sound of the fire fill the space. When I opened them again, something on the shelf caught my attention, an old wooden chest I hadn't seen in years. Inside were photo albums, tax records, and a folder labeled Harrison Financial Trust. My heart gave a small jolt. I pulled it out, flipping through the yellowed papers. There it was, the document from decades ago, when I'd invested in the company that later grew into one of Colorado's largest financial firms. My firm. I'd forgotten about the shares tucked away under Helen's management after I retired. The trust still bore my name as a primary holder. I stared at the papers, the numbers, the signatures. All these years, I'd quietly held a part of something Ethan thought he'd built his life around. I leaned back in the chair, the firelight catching the edge of the folder. "So that's how it is," I murmured. "He calls me greedy while cashing the checks my name pays for." A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. Then, for the first time since the argument, a strange calm settled over me. The humiliation still burned, but beneath it was something else, a slow, deliberate sense of clarity. I wasn't powerless. I never had been. I just forgot that the world I'd built was still standing, even if no one gave me credit for it. The fire roared higher, as if agreeing with me. I pulled out Helen's old leather journal from the chest, the one where she used to jot down recipes and thoughts. I tore out a blank page and wrote in my careful handwriting, "Tomorrow I start fresh." Not to hurt them, but to remind them who built the ground they walk on. I placed the note on the table beside me and closed the journal. The fire had burned down to embers, soft and red. I turned off the lantern, the darkness wrapping gently around me. Outside, the first hint of dawn brushed the sky pale silver against the dark ridge of the mountains. I sat there watching it grow brighter through the window, feeling the weight of the night lift ever so slightly. The world hadn't ended. It had only shifted its balance. And for the first time in a long while, I was done pretending I didn't matter. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of the cabin, soft and golden. For the first time in days, I woke without the heaviness of anger pressing on my chest. The storm had passed both outside and inside. The air smelled of wet pine and cold earth, and somewhere far down the mountain, a creek murmured softly under the melting snow. I sat up slowly, joints aching, and stared at the faint smoke trail from last night's fire. I brewed coffee on the old gas stove the same way Helen used to when we came here on weekends. The pot hissed and popped, filling the cabin with that familiar scent, simple grounding. I poured a cup, took a sip, and felt the warmth spread through me. On the table, Helen's journal lay open beside the folder I'd found last night. The papers looked almost unreal in the morning light, the black ink still crisp after all these years. I picked them up and reread the details, this time with a clearer mind. The trust had been quietly earning dividends for decades. The numbers were small at first, then grew with the company year after year, compounding into something far larger than I had ever imagined. Helen had always been the one who understood these things better than I did. She'd handled the paperwork, the legal details, the renewals. When she passed, I assumed everything had dissolved with her. But it hadn't. It had stayed here waiting like some forgotten seed, finally sprouting after the storm. I took another sip of coffee and whispered to the air. "You always did think ahead, didn't you, Helen?" The decision came easily. I needed to know more. I folded the documents neatly into my leather briefcase and drove down the winding mountain road toward Estes Park. The snow on the edges of the asphalt sparkled like dusted glass, and the world looked cleaner, quieter. When I reached town, I parked in front of a modern glass building with a silver sign that read Harrison Financial Group, the same name that had appeared on my old paperwork. Inside the lobby was sleek and sterile marble floors, a digital kiosk, and soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. A young receptionist with perfect posture greeted me with a professional smile. "Good morning, sir." "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, adjusting my coat, "but I'd like to speak to someone about a legacy shareholder account. It's under the Whitman Trust, dated 1988. Her smile faltered for a second, replaced by polite confusion. "One moment, please." She disappeared into a side office. A few minutes later, a man in his early 30s emerged, sharp suit expensive, watched the kind of person who measured confidence in percentages. "Mr. Whitman," he asked, extending a hand. "I'm Timothy Harris, branch manager. Please come in." His office smelled faintly of leather and new carpet. I handed him the folder, and he began scanning through the papers. His expression shifted subtly as he read. "These documents are quite old," he said carefully. "But everything looks legitimate. The trust appears to have rolled over multiple times. You've maintained ownership through several mergers." "Mergers?" I asked. He nodded, tapping the header. Harrison Financial was acquired by the Alden Group about 15 years ago. The trust's holdings were transferred accordingly. You currently hold approximately... He stopped mid-sentence, glanced at the computer screen, and looked back at me. 12.3% of Alden's parent portfolio. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a lot for something I forgot existed. He chuckled nervously. "It's a substantial share, Mr. Whitman. In fact, that makes you one of the company's largest private shareholders. May I ask, do you wish to make any changes to your portfolio?" "No," I said simply. "Not yet." He leaned forward. "Would you like to be informed about corporate operations? You may not realize this, but one of our regional divisions is led by..." He hesitated, scrolling through the list. "Ethan Whitman. Any relation?" My lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Yes," I said. "My son." The man blinked, uncertain how to respond. "Ah. Well, that's quite the coincidence." "Coincidence?" I repeated quietly, almost to myself. "Yes, quite." He cleared his throat. "If you'd like, I can prepare updated statements and shareholder verification forms for your records." We can also arrange for access to our internal shareholder portal. That won't be necessary, I interrupted, standing up. I prefer paper. Of course, he said quickly. We'll mail everything within the week. I thanked him, shook his hand, and left. Outside, the winter air felt sharper, but lighter somehow. I walked down the street toward the small park at the end of the block, the paper still warm in my hand. I sat on a bench, unfolded one of the statements, and stared at the numbers. For years, I'd thought of myself as a retired man, a relic of another time. But here on this paper was proof that I still had a say in the world my son thought he ruled. A laugh escaped me, soft, genuine, without bitterness. You see this, Helen? I murmured to the sky. He threw me out of his house, but he's been living under mine all along. A few pigeons scattered at the sound of my voice. But I didn't care. I felt alive again, not in the foolish way of revenge, but in the quiet way of realization. Life had a strange sense of balance. For all Ethan's arrogance, for all Melissa's entitlement, everything they valued came from a foundation I had built decades before they even understood the meaning of work. I sat there for a long time, watching the clouds drift across the blue. Then I took out Helen's journal and began to write. I don't want to hurt him. I just want him to see the truth. That respect isn't inherited, it's earned. The words steadied me. When I finished, I closed the journal, slipped it into my coat pocket, and stood. Across the street, a payphone booth stood like a relic from my era. I crossed over, picked up the receiver, and dialed an old number I hadn't used in years. Robert Lang. A familiar voice answered after a few rings. Robert, I said, smiling faintly. It's George Whitman. There was a pause, then a burst of surprise. George? Well, I'll be damned. It's been, 20 years? Are you still hiding up in those mountains? Something like that, I said. Tell me, Robert, you still with Alden Group? I am. Senior advisor these days. Mostly paperwork and long meetings. He laughed. Why are you looking to invest again? In a way, I replied. I just learned I never stopped. He whistled low. You found the old trust, didn't you? I did. And I'd like to stay anonymous for now. But I'd appreciate an update on internal matters. Robert's tone grew more serious. You mean the board, the executives? Let's start with the regional branches, I said. Particularly the Denver division. A pause. Then that would be your son's department, wouldn't it? It would, I said. He hesitated. George, are you planning something? Nothing rash, I assured him. Just a correction of balance. He chuckled softly. Still the same calm operator, I see. I'll look into it. Thank you, Robert, I said. And one more thing. Don't mention this call to anyone, especially not to the Whitman name. You have my word, he said. When I hung up, the afternoon sun had turned golden over the rooftops. I stood there, the wind tugging lightly at my coat, and for the first time in weeks I felt steady. Wasn't just a father cast aside. I was a builder, a shareholder, a man who still owned more of the world than those who dismissed him. Back at the cabin that evening, I lit the fireplace again. The flames danced, casting flickers of orange on the walls. I opened Helen's journal to a new page and wrote, Revenge is only poison when served with hate. When served with truth, it's medicine. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, silent, forgiving. I watched it cover the trail leading down the mountain until it vanished into white. By the time the snow melted, and I knew the truth would already be moving through the halls of Harrison Financial. Snow had settled thick across the mountains by the time a week passed. The world outside the cabin looked untouched. A soft, white silence stretching in every direction. Inside, the fire cracked gently while I sat at the table with a cup of coffee and Helen's journal open beside me. The air smelled of pine and smoke. Each morning started the same now, quiet, deliberate, peaceful. But under that calm, something was moving. I could feel it. When people stop seeing you as a threat, that's when you have the most power. I had learned that after retirement, when younger men smiled politely and dismissed me as harmless. It was always easier to work unseen. I took a sip of coffee and dialed Robert Lang's number. The old rotary phone clicked as it connected. George, he answered on the second ring. "I've been expecting your call." "You mentioned a board meeting," I said. "Yes. Next Friday. They're reviewing regional performance, including Denver. Your son's division." He hesitated. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" "I'm not going through with anything," I said. "I just want information. Send me the reports when you have them. You'll have them by the weekend." I thanked him, hung up, and stared out the window. The trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow. Somewhere far below, I could hear the faint hum of the town beginning its day. I'd never liked interference, but the world was already interfering with me. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. That afternoon, I walked into town to check the Post. The locals nodded politely as I passed people who knew me as the quiet old man from the cabin, not the man who still owned 12% of a financial empire. I liked that anonymity. It gave me time to think. By evening, the sky had turned pink with sunset. I lit the lamp, opened Helen's journal, and wrote one sentence before closing it again. Silence is the sharpest blade. In Denver, the silence was breaking. Ethan stood by his office window, staring at the snow that fell between the skyscrapers. His reflection looked pale in the glass. The morning had been brutal: 3 client calls, 2 project delays, 1 terse email from the regional director. Something was shifting at Harrison Financial, and he could feel it in the way people avoided his eyes in the hallway. His assistant Rachel knocked lightly on the door. "They postponed the budget meeting again," she said. "No new date." Ethan frowned. "That's the 3rd time this month." She nodded, hesitating. "I also heard they're auditing several branches. Some compliance issue." "Which branch is Denver's on the list?" He turned back to the window, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Of course it is." When she left, he sat down, scrolling through his emails. Every message felt colder than the last. Words like review evaluation and restructure kept appearing. It was all corporate language, sterile but heavy with implication. He rubbed his temples and told himself it was coincidence. But deep down, he knew how these things started, with whispers, small and invisible, at first spreading until they became fact. Melissa showed up at lunch, her coat draped perfectly over her shoulders, the scent of expensive perfume following her into the office. "You look awful," she said, sitting down on the edge of his desk. "Thanks," he muttered. "What happened now?" "Nothing. Just office politics." She raised an eyebrow. "Politics or mistakes?" He glared at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I mean," she said lightly, "you've been distracted. And ever since your father's little stunt, you've been obsessed with proving something. Maybe it's catching up with you." He leaned back, staring at her. "You think this is about him?" "Everything's about him," she said with a shrug. "You can't let it go. Maybe he's finally getting what he wanted to make you doubt yourself." Ethan laughed bitterly. "He's in a cabin somewhere. He couldn't pull strings if he tried." Melissa smiled faintly. Are you sure her words stayed with him long after she left? He closed his laptop, unable to focus. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: fear. At the cabin 3 days later, an envelope arrived from Robert. Inside were the reports, detailed, precise, and damning. Ethan's division had overspent its budget by nearly 15%. Client retention had dropped. Employee satisfaction ratings were the lowest in the region. And buried in a small note at the bottom was the phrase "under internal review." I marked the lines in pencil and sat back in my chair. Numbers didn't lie. I didn't need to. That night, I drafted a short anonymous message addressed to the board of directors. Certain management decisions in the Denver branch may warrant oversight before next quarter's fiscal close. I enclosed the report excerpts, sealed the envelope, and dropped it in the postbox before dawn. When I returned to the cabin, the snow had started again, soft and slow. I watched it fall as I warmed my hands by the fire. "I'm not punishing him," I whispered to Helen's photo on the mantel. "I'm letting the truth do its work." By the end of the week, the whispers reached Ethan's floor. Meetings were delayed again. 2 of his department heads were called into private sessions without explanation. His access to certain accounts was temporarily restricted pending verification. No one said it aloud, but he could feel the shift, the avoidance, the polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. At home, he sat at the kitchen counter with a drink in his hand, staring into the glass. Melissa moved around the room like nothing was wrong. "You're quiet," she said finally. "Just tired." "Of what? Everything?" He hesitated. "People are talking. They think the board's planning cuts." Melissa poured herself a glass of wine. "So fix it." "I can't fix what I can't see," he said. "It's like someone's pulling strings behind the scenes." She gave a short laugh. "Maybe your father's finally proving he's smarter than you." "Melissa." His tone was sharp. She shrugged. "You're the one who said he was harmless. Maybe he's not." He didn't answer. Instead, he went to the window, watching the snow blur the city lights. He suddenly felt small, like the world he'd built was shifting beneath him. Meanwhile, in Estes Park, my phone rang again. Robert's voice came through the static. "You've started quite a storm, old friend. The board's investigating Denver's leadership next week." "I only asked for transparency," I said. He chuckled. "Transparency or justice? Sometimes they're the same thing." "You could have his position reassigned," Robert said after a pause. "They'd listen to a shareholder like you." "No," I said. "I don't want him destroyed. I just want him to see the ground he's been standing on." "You always were the patient one," Robert said. "I'll keep you updated." When the call ended, I sat for a long time staring at the fire. The logs had burned low, glowing red and steady. I reached for Helen's journal and wrote another line. "Truth whispered becomes justice spoken." Outside, the snow thickened, covering the steps and trees in silence. Down in Denver, my son stayed late in his glass office, staring at spreadsheets that refused to balance emails he didn't understand, decisions he no longer controlled. He rubbed his eyes, picked up his phone, and saw the missed calls piling up. He didn't know it yet, but the hands that built his future were already rearranging it. The morning sky over Denver was the color of cold steel. The city moved in slow motion beneath a layer of pale cloud, the streets quiet, the air brittle with frost. Ethan stood by the window of his bedroom, watching his own reflection instead of the skyline. He hadn't slept. His tie hung loose around his neck, his eyes hollow. Melissa passed behind him, silent, pouring herself coffee. Neither spoke. He'd been called into an urgent executive review that morning. The email had come late last night, short and formal. Attendance mandatory, that was all it said. Ethan had spent the hours since replaying every decision of the last 6 months, budgets, clients, staff, turnover. There was nothing catastrophic, but too many small cracks could bring down a wall. He put on his coat, checked his watch, and turned to Melissa. "Don't wait up for me." She didn't look up from her cup. "You're making it sound like an execution." He forced a thin smile. "Maybe it is." When the door shut behind him, she stood at the counter, staring into her coffee until it went cold. At the cabin, I sat with the morning paper and a quiet mind. The fire burned low, and the smell of pine smoke lingered. I wasn't waiting for news, but I knew it would come. Some things didn't need confirmation. They unfolded like clockwork. I glanced at Helen's picture on the mantel. "If you're watching," I said softly, "keep me from turning cruel." In Denver, Ethan's shoes clicked across the marble floor of Harrison Financial's lobby. The receptionist gave him a polite but strained smile before gesturing toward the elevators. "The boardroom, Mr. Whitman. They're already waiting." The elevator ride felt longer than usual. His reflection stared back from the mirrored walls, pale and uncertain. When the doors opened, the sound of voices cut through the quiet, low, steady businesslike. The conference room stretched the length of the floor glass walls overlooking the city. Around the table sat 8 people, the board chair, legal counsel, senior advisors. And at the far end, Robert Lang, his expression unreadable. "Good morning, Mr. Whitman," Robert said. "Please have a seat." Ethan adjusted his tie and took the chair at the far end of the table. His hands were slick with sweat. "We'll make this brief," Robert continued. "Your quarterly review raised several concerns: budget irregularities, client retention compliance procedures. I'd like you to walk us through these numbers." Ethan opened his folder. "Of course. There's a reasonable explanation for each point." The overspending was tied to client expansion efforts and the retention issue. Robert lifted a hand. "I've read your report, but our internal audit shows misallocation beyond approved parameters, and several clients you listed as active have terminated contracts." "That's not correct," Ethan said quickly. "We have ongoing negotiations, which weren't disclosed." The legal counsel interrupted. "It appears your department's reporting has been, let's say, optimistic." The air thickened. Ethan looked around the table. No one met his eyes. He felt his heartbeat hammering in his chest. "If there's a misunderstanding, I can clarify it." Robert leaned back, his voice calm but final. "We're not questioning your intent, Ethan. But perception is reality in this business. The board has voted to reassign you at the end of the quarter. You'll retain your benefits, of course." For a moment, the words didn't register. Reassign. Not fire. Not suspend. But the humiliation cut deeper than either. He stood too quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice tight. "You need someone who actually understands this market, not—" "Enough," Robert said quietly. "Take this as a professional courtesy. We're protecting your record." Ethan's throat burned. He wanted to argue, to fight, but the room had already moved on. Papers shuffled. The meeting was over. He left the boardroom without saying another word. Downstairs, employees watched him pass through the open plan office. Conversations hushed. A few exchanged sympathetic glances. Most didn't look up at all. He pushed through the revolving doors into the cold. Snow had begun to fall again, thin, sharp flakes that melted on contact. He stood there for a moment, the city moving around him, the sound of traffic distant and dull. Mercy. That was what Robert had called it. He let out a hollow laugh that fogged in the air. At that same hour, the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. The phone rang once, twice. I let it go to the third before picking up. "It's done," Robert said on the line. His voice sounded tired. "He's being reassigned. No scandal, no press. Just a quiet exit." "Good," I said. "He deserves a chance to rebuild." "You don't sound happy." "I'm not," I admitted. "Justice isn't supposed to taste sweet." Robert was silent for a moment. "You know you could have taken this further. The board would have backed you." "I know," I said. "But that's not what I wanted. I just wanted him to see the ground he's been standing on." Robert's tone softened. "Maybe you've done both of you a favor." When the call ended, I sat back staring at the fire until the edges of the logs blurred. Helen's voice echoed in my head. "Don't let justice turn your heart cold, Norb, even when you're right." I poured myself a glass of water, though what I wanted was whiskey. That evening, Ethan returned home to a house that felt too big. Melissa was waiting in the kitchen, her phone in one hand, a half-finished glass of wine in the other. "Well?" she asked. He set his briefcase down on the counter. "They're reassigning me." "Reassigning," she repeated, incredulous. "That's a polite way of saying they don't trust you anymore." He looked up sharply. "You think I don't know that?" "Do you know what that means for us?" she snapped. "Our reputation, our income, everything." "Our," he interrupted. "Or yours?" She froze. "Excuse me, you heard me," he said. His voice was flat but trembling underneath. "You've been worried about appearances since the day we got married. Maybe that's why you liked me, because I looked successful enough to decorate your life." Her lips parted, stunned. "You're drunk." "I'm sober," he said. "Sober enough to realize maybe my father was right about you." The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. Melissa's expression hardened. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door. "Call me when you're ready to be an adult." The door slammed and the echo filled the house. Ethan sank onto a chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The silence was absolute. He'd spent years chasing respect, control, power, and now all of it had slipped through his fingers in a single day. At the cabin, I felt the weight of the same silence. The fire was burning low, and outside the snow fell without sound. Robert called again later that night. "He'll survive," he said. "He's shaken, but not ruined. Maybe this will make him wiser." "Maybe," I said softly. After he hung up, I walked to the window. The forest below was dark, the snow glinting in the moonlight. I picked up Helen's journal and wrote one line before setting it down again. "Justice is never free. It always takes a piece of you, too." The fire crackled once, then went quiet. I stood there listening to the wind outside and wondering whether in teaching him this lesson, I'd forgotten how to forgive. The house was too quiet. Ethan had never noticed before how much space there was between sounds, the click of the furnace, the ticking clock, the wind pushing against the windows. A week had passed since the reassignment, and Melissa had barely spoken to him. She left early in the morning, came home late, and when she was there, she filled the silence with music or phone calls. Anything but conversation. He sat at his desk, scrolling through job listings, each one smaller than the last. Titles that once would have been beneath him now looked like lifelines. But even then, he couldn't bring himself to click apply. His pride still held him hostage. His inbox was full of automated replies and old company announcements. Nobody called, nobody reached out. He was invisible now, the same way he'd once made others feel. At night he wandered the house in his socks, the hardwood cold against his feet. Every room echoed with something that wasn't there anymore. His son's laughter from years ago, the clinking of wine glasses from dinner parties, his father's calm voice on the phone asking how things were. He had always rushed those calls, cutting them short with excuses about meetings or clients. Now the silence after each unanswered ring was louder than any argument they'd ever had. He stood in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. There was one from a long ago Thanksgiving. He was younger, confident, his arm around Melissa, his father standing off to the side with a shy smile. Back then, the distance between them was already there, invisible but growing. Ethan pressed his thumb against the glass of that photo and whispered, "I should have called you back. Up in the mountains, I couldn't sleep." The fire had gone out, and the cold crept through the cracks in the cabin walls. I turned over in bed, but Helen's voice wouldn't leave my mind. I saw Ethan's face at that meeting, his eyes wide with panic, his pride cracking like glass under pressure. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong, that I'd simply let the truth reveal itself, but the image lingered. I sat up, reached for the lamp, and lit it. Helen's photo sat on the nightstand, her smile soft, even after all these years. Was this justice, I asked quietly, or just punishment with better manners? The question hung in the air like smoke. I stood, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table. Helen's journal was open to a blank page. I picked up the pen, but couldn't write. The words wouldn't come. The silence between us, the one that used to comfort me now, felt heavy, accusing. The next morning, I stepped outside. The snow had frozen overnight hard and shining under the pale sun. Each breath came out in white clouds. I walked to the fence line, listening to the crunch of my boots. Somewhere below, the town stirred awake. I thought about calling Ethan, but stopped myself. Pride, the same old enemy, still sat in my chest, like a stone. In Denver, Ethan drove to his old office to collect what little was left. The receptionist greeted him politely, but avoided eye contact. They said, "You could take anything personal," she said. "The rest will be shipped." His nameplate was gone from the door. Inside, the shelves were bare, except for a framed certificate and a photo of him, Melissa, and Hayden at a company gala. He slipped both into a box. "Rachel." His former assistant appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "I didn't think you'd come in person," she said softly. "I needed to see it," Ethan replied. She helped him pack in silence. Before leaving, she looked at him with genuine sadness. "You were a good boss," she said. "Maybe too proud for your own good. But you cared about people. Don't forget that part." He nodded, unable to speak. When she left, he turned to the wall of portraits lining the hallway. Executives, founders, major investors. Faces from decades ago, smiling in sepia tones. His eyes drifted across the rows until one name froze him in place. George Whitman. He leaned closer, reading the caption beneath the photograph, "Founding Investor, 1988. His heart stumbled in his chest. His father. He stepped back the hallway, spinning slightly. The truth slid into place, clean and cruel. His father hadn't just been some retired accountant with dusty trophies and small savings. He had helped build the very company that now dismissed Ethan like a disposable part. He felt dizzy, humiliated, ashamed. So that's why he looked so calm, Ethan thought bitterly. He knew all along. Back at the cabin, the afternoon light began to fade. I chopped wood behind the house more for distraction than warmth. Each swing of the axe was steady, rhythmic. With every strike, I tried to drive out the guilt that had taken root inside me. But guilt, like winter, doesn't leave just because you want it to. When I came back inside, I saw the phone on the table. I sat down, staring at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over Ethan's name in the contact list. I wanted to tell him that I'd never meant to destroy him, only to make him see. But I couldn't bring myself to press the button. Not yet. At the same moment, miles away, Ethan sat in his car outside that same glass building. Snow drifted down around him, clinging to the windshield. He held his father's old contact card, the one he'd kept in his wallet for years, more out of habit than sentiment. He took out his phone, found the number, and stared at it. His hand trembled slightly. In that strange symmetry, two men sat in silence, each waiting for the other to break it. As evening fell, I decided to take a walk. The air was sharp, the sky streaked with pink and silver. I followed the path that wound down toward the frozen stream. Halfway there, my boot slipped on a patch of ice, and I fell hard onto my wrist. Pain shot up my arm. "Damn fool," I muttered, sitting in the snow. A voice came from behind me. "You okay, sir?" I turned to see a young man, maybe mid-20s, wearing a backpack and hiking boots. He offered a hand and helped me up. "I'm fine," I said, though my wrist throbbed. "You sure that was a bad fall?" He insisted on walking me back to the cabin. On the porch, he smiled. "You remind me of my dad," he said. "Haven't talked to him in years. I should probably fix that." I froze, hearing my own thoughts echoed in a stranger's voice. "Yeah," I managed. "You probably should." He waved goodbye and disappeared down the trail. I stood there for a while, the ache in my wrist fading beneath something deeper. That night, the fire glowed softly in the hearth. I sat with Helen's journal open again, the pen steady in my hand this time. The words came slowly, but surely. There's no justice without forgiveness. I taught him too late, and maybe I'm learning the same lesson now. I set the pen down and reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over Ethan's number. I typed out a message. "Hope you're doing all right, son. The mountains are quiet tonight." I stared at it for a long time, the glow of the screen casting pale light across the room. Then I locked the phone and set it beside the journal. The message remained unsent. Outside, the snow began again, soft and endless, covering everything in white. Some silences I thought are heavy because of what's been lost. Others, because of what still might be found. The days moved slowly, one bleeding into the next, each one quieter than the one before. The snow outside had hardened into a silver crust, and the air that crept in through the cracks in the cabin walls was sharp enough to sting. I told myself I wasn't waiting for anything, but my eyes drifted to the phone on the table more times than I could count. Every night I placed it beside the bed before turning off the lamp, the dark screen reflecting my face back at me. I told myself it didn't matter whether it lit up or not. I was lying. The silence between us used to be peaceful, the kind that comes with understanding. Now it felt like punishment. I made tea in the mornings, stoked the fire, and forced myself to read newspapers I didn't care about. Sometimes I caught myself muttering half-formed sentences as if he were here to answer. It was absurd, an old man talking to ghosts, but it was better than saying nothing at all. In Denver, Ethan's house was falling apart in slow motion. The blinds stayed closed most days. The kitchen smelled faintly of sour wine and old coffee. Melissa hadn't returned since their argument, and he'd stopped calling after the third day. Her absence didn't feel like freedom. It felt like being buried alive under everything he'd built. He wandered from room to room, touching things just to hear a sound. Books, glasses, the piano in the living room that no one had ever played. He pressed a single key, and the note rang out into the stillness, fading too quickly. He tried again, and again. The echo seemed to mock him. For the first time, he understood what solitude really meant. It wasn't quiet. It was noise that had nowhere to go. I drove into town that Wednesday more out of habit than need. The roads were slick but clear. In the cafe across from the post office, Clara was refilling sugar jars when she saw me come in. "Well, look who decided to rejoin the world," she said with a smile. I sat at the counter. "Just passing through." She poured me a cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. "Still no word from your boy?" I shook my head. "No. But I wrote something." "Then send it," she said simply. "It's not that easy." Clara smirked. "Sure it is. It just takes courage instead of pride." Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I nodded, pretending to laugh, but I carried that line with me all the way home. That afternoon, I tried to work in the shed, replacing a broken hinge, sorting tools, but my hands wouldn't steady. The letter sat on my desk inside, folded, neatly sealed, but unsent. I told myself I'd take it to the post office tomorrow. Tomorrow had been my favorite excuse lately. Ethan sat in his car outside his childhood home. He hadn't planned to come here, but his hands had steered him there without asking permission. The white picket fence looked smaller than he remembered, the paint flaking at the corners. The maple tree in the front yard was bare now, its limbs like outstretched arms, frozen mid-motion. He parked across the street, engine idling. Through the window he could see the warm glow of the living room lamp. A stranger's car sat in the driveway. New owners, new life. For a long time he watched the window the way he used to watch his father read by that same light. The memories came back in fragments summer evenings, when his mother's laughter filled the kitchen, his father working late on tax forms, the way Helen would scold them both for being too serious. Back then everything felt small, but safe. Now it felt unreachable. He whispered to himself, "I treated him like he was already gone. The words caught in his throat. He turned off the engine, stepped out, and stood for a moment in the cold. He thought about walking up to the door, knocking just once, asking whoever lived there now if he could just look inside. But what would that prove? That time had moved on without him, that he'd abandoned something he never really understood. The porch light flicked on suddenly, and the moment broke. He got back in the car and drove away, headlights cutting through the dark. That evening, I sat at the cabin table, the lamp throwing a warm circle of light across the wood. The letter waited where I'd left it. Helen's lavender-scented paper, my uneven handwriting. I opened it again, rereading the lines I'd written days before. I didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe I did. Maybe I wanted you to see what pride costs. But I forgot it costs both of us. The ink had bled slightly where I'd pressed too hard. I added another line beneath it. You don't owe me forgiveness. I just want you to live better than I did, not richer, not smarter, just kinder. I folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and pressed the seal shut. I left it on the table beside the phone. Tomorrow, I told myself. I'd send it tomorrow. In Denver, Ethan sat at his own desk, staring at a blank email. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." He started typing, "Dad, I've been thinking about everything that happened. You were right about more than I wanted to admit. I wish I'd listened sooner." He paused, deleted the last sentence, started again. The cursor blinked on the empty screen. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Tomorrow, he thought. He'd write it tomorrow. Up in the mountains, I watched the fire burn low. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moonlight. The cabin felt too big for one man's regrets. I reached for the phone just to check the time, but my hand lingered over the screen. My message to him, unsent, still sitting in drafts, stared back at me. "Hope you're doing all right, son. The mountains are quiet tonight." I read it again, then set the phone down beside the letter. The battery light blinked red. I plugged it in and dozed off in the chair. The sound of wind brushing against the windows. Somewhere far away, Ethan closed his laptop, the apology erased. He sat in darkness for a long time, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. When he finally stood, he walked to the window and looked out over the city. Lights flickered in other apartments, other lives continuing unbroken. He pressed his forehead to the cold glass. "Tomorrow," he whispered. In the cabin, the fire had gone out. The phone buzzed once, faintly. My name lit up on Ethan's screen as his call connected for half a ring before cutting off. Maybe he'd hesitated. Maybe the signal had dropped. Maybe fate had its own ideas. I didn't wake. The sound faded into the night, leaving only the whisper of snow against the roof. The call almost came that night, but silence once again arrived first. The wind roared through the mountains, rattling the window panes as George woke to the pale light of morning. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, leaving the cabin cold. He sat up slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in his joints, and reached for his robe. Outside, snow was falling thick and heavy again. It had been a long winter one that didn't seem interested in ending. He stepped out onto the porch, breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The woodpile near the fence was buried beneath a crust of ice. He needed more logs for the fire, and there was no one else to fetch them. "Just another morning," he muttered, pulling on his gloves. The first few steps down the path were steady, but as he reached for the axe, his boots slipped on a patch of ice hidden under the snow. The world tilted. His hand caught the edge of the log pile, then missed. He went down hard. A crack shot through his hip and wrist like lightning. The pain came fast, hot, and blinding. He tried to get up, but couldn't. The snow soaked through his clothes, numbing him almost immediately. He called out, voice hoarse, "Help, somebody." But the mountains answered only with wind. His breath grew shorter, the cold biting deeper. Crawling inch by inch, he tried to make it back to the cabin. His glove slipped, his fingers went numb. "Helen?" he whispered, half-conscious. "Not yet." Back in Denver, Ethan was awake early, staring at the half-written email on his laptop. The subject line read, "I'm sorry." He'd typed it days ago, rewritten it twice, and still hadn't sent it. The silence between him and his father had begun to feel like another person in the room, one that never left. He rubbed his face, shut the laptop, and poured coffee he didn't want. The sky outside was gray, the city wrapped in fog. Something about the morning felt wrong, though he couldn't explain why. He pulled on his coat, intending to drive north, not to apologize, not really just to see the mountains. Maybe that was excuse enough. The phone buzzed just as he started the car. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but instinct made him swipe the screen. "Mr. Whitman." The voice was shaky, male older. "This is Harold, your father's neighbor, up near Estes Park. I found him outside the cabin this morning. He's alive, but he took a fall. They've taken him to St. Mary's Hospital." For a moment, Ethan couldn't breathe. "Is he conscious, barely?" "They said he'll pull through if they got to him in time. I'm on my way." He hung up, heart pounding. The drive north blurred into gray and white snow trees road. His thoughts collided with memories, all tangled with guilt. The last words he'd spoken to his father echoed in his head. "Get out. You're too greedy." By the time he reached the hospital, the storm had started to ease. He parked crookedly, barely turning off the engine before running inside. The nurse at the front desk recognized his name immediately. "Room 213, she said. "He's awake but weak. Don't stay too long." Ethan walked down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. The scent of antiseptic and winter air filled his lungs. He stopped outside the door, staring through the narrow glass pane. His father lay in the bed, pale but alive, an IV running into his arm. When George opened his eyes, they met his son's. For a long second, neither spoke. Then George's lips twitched into something like a smile. "You finally made it." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "You scared the hell out of me." George's voice was thin but steady. Wouldn't be the first time. Ethan pulled up a chair beside the bed. "How bad is it?" "Just bruised pride and a fractured hip. Doctor says I'll be walking again soon." He looked at Ethan for a long moment. "I thought you wouldn't come." "I almost didn't," Ethan admitted. "But I guess I ran out of excuses." George's eyes softened. "You get that from me." The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was fragile, uncertain, but alive. Outside, the storm quieted into a soft drizzle of snow. The nurse came in briefly, adjusted the blankets, then left them alone again. Ethan looked at the machines beeping beside the bed. "I saw your name at the office," he said finally. "The Wall of Founders?" "I didn't know." "I never told you." "Why?" George sighed. "Because it wasn't supposed to matter. It was your world, not mine. You had to build it without my shadow hanging over you." Ethan leaned back, shaking his head. "I thought you didn't believe in me, that you didn't think I could handle things." "I did," George said. "But you wouldn't have listened if I'd said it." They both laughed quietly, the sound rough but real. Ethan rubbed his face, then looked up again. "I said some things I shouldn't have." "So did I," George replied. "Seems to run in the family." For the first time in years, the air between them felt lighter. Ethan reached out, hesitated, then placed his hand gently on his father's. George didn't pull away. "I found your letter," Ethan said after a moment. "The nurse gave it to me." George blinked. "You read it?" "Outside under the lights," Ethan said softly. "Every word." He took a breath. You don't need to worry about forgiveness. I think I'm the one who owes you that." George's eyes glistened. "Son, forgiveness isn't about debt. It's just what's left when the fight's over." Ethan nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "Then, I guess we're done fighting." The nurse returned, reminding them visiting hours were nearly over. Ethan stood reluctant to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said. "You'll find me here?" George said with a faint smile. "Nowhere else to go." When Ethan stepped outside, the snow had stopped completely. The sky was clearing, and the first hints of dawn glowed at the edge of the horizon. He pulled his coat tighter and slipped the folded letter from his pocket. The paper was worn, the handwriting slightly smudged, but it felt warm in his hands. Back inside, George stirred in his sleep. For the first time in years, his dreams were peaceful. He saw Helen sitting by the window, sunlight in her hair, smiling. "You did all right," she whispered. "You finally crossed the bridge." He murmured something in reply, half in sleep. Hours later, Ethan returned with coffee and 2 sandwiches. George was awake, staring out the window at the snow-capped peaks. Ethan sat down beside him. "Mountains look different in the morning," George said. "They do," Ethan replied. "Everything does." They ate in silence, not needing words. When George's hand trembled slightly, Ethan reached over to steady the cup. Their eyes met. "Thanks, son," George said quietly. Ethan smiled. "You finally called me that again." Outside, the sun climbed higher, spilling light through the glass and painting the room gold. For a long time, neither man spoke. They didn't need to. Between them, the silence finally began to melt. The first morning back at the cabin smelled like pine and wet earth. The snow had finally melted, leaving the path muddy but clear. George moved slowly, leaning on a cane, his breath clouding faintly in the cool spring air. The mountains were alive again, streams whispering, birds darting between budding branches. Ethan trailed behind him, carrying a bag of groceries and a box of firewood. It felt strange to have company in the cabin again, the silence filled with 2 sets of footsteps instead of 1. George lowered himself into the porch chair with a sigh. "Feels good to be back," he said. Ethan set down the groceries, smiling faintly. "You should probably rest. Doctor said to take it easy." "I've been lying down for 2 weeks," George grumbled. "If I rest anymore, I'll start growing moss." The banter was light, but under it hung something fragile and new. A sense of mutual care that neither dared name. Ethan busied himself making coffee, and soon the familiar smell filled the cabin. 2 mugs sat on the table, steam curling upward. George sipped and winced. Still too weak, he muttered, adding sugar when he thought Ethan wasn't watching. The radio hummed softly in the background, a station playing old Sinatra tunes. It was the same one Helen used to play on slow Sunday mornings. George caught Ethan glancing toward the framed photo on the mantel, his mother forever smiling under a summer hat. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence, for once, wasn't heavy. By midday, Ethan had unpacked the groceries and insisted on checking the generator. George tried to follow him outside. "Dad, sit down," Ethan said, half amused, half exasperated. "I broke a hip." "Not my hands," George shot back. "You think I've forgotten how to start my own damn generator?" Ethan crossed his arms. "You shouldn't be lifting anything yet. I've been living here 30 years. Don't start acting like I'm made of glass." The words came sharper than either intended. Ethan took a breath, jaw tightening. "I'm just trying to help." George turned away. "I know. But let me do what I can, son. A man still needs to feel useful." The air between them cooled quiet except for the steady hum of the wind through the trees. Ethan eventually nodded, stepping back. "Okay. You win." "Damn right," George said, but the fight had already drained out of him. That night over stew and bread, Ethan cleared his throat. "Sorry," he said. "For what?" "For treating you like you couldn't handle yourself." "Guess I forget how stubborn you are." George chuckled softly. "You get that from your mother?" She hated admitting she was wrong too. Ethan smiled, shaking his head. "Then I'm doomed." "Pretty much." They laughed together, the tension fading as easily as it came. For the first time, laughter didn't feel like pretending things were fine. It felt like the start of something healing. Later that evening, after George went to bed, Ethan found himself wandering through the small office at the back of the cabin. On the desk sat a worn leather notebook, pages filled with George's cramped handwriting. Letters addressed to Helen, written after her death. Ethan flipped through, carefully reading fragments of a life he'd never known. "You would have laughed at how bad my cooking still is. The boy's doing well. You'd be proud. Some days the house feels too quiet, but I still talk to you anyway." At the last page, Ethan hesitated, then reached for a pen. He began to write. "Dad, I spent half my life trying to be someone you'd respect, and the other half pretending I didn't care if you did. Maybe that's on me. Maybe it's both of us. I just want you to know I'm proud of you too." He left the notebook open on the desk and went to bed. When George woke early the next morning, he found the note. He sat for a long while reading the words again and again. His throat tightened. The handwriting wasn't perfect. The ink smudged where Ethan must have hesitated, but it was enough. He didn't mention it when Ethan came in later, yawning and rubbing his eyes. He just poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table without a word. The days that followed settled into an easy rhythm. They worked side by side, fixing the porch railing, patching the leak in the roof. Ethan insisted on doing the heavier work, but George always found something to keep his hands busy. Each evening they sat by the fire, talking about nothing in particular. Sports, the weather, Helen's apple pie recipe, neither of them could quite get right. One afternoon, Ethan stood by the window, watching the light fade across the valley. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. George smiled faintly. "Every winter, and every spring I remember why I stay." Ethan nodded. "Maybe I'll bring Hayden up here sometime. He should see this before he's too old to care." "That'd be nice," George said quietly. "The boy deserves to know where he comes from." The following day, Ethan suggested visiting Helen's grave before heading back to Denver. George hesitated, then agreed. They drove down the mountain road, the truck rattling with every turn. The cemetery was small, surrounded by tall cedars and wildflowers just beginning to bloom. George laid a small bouquet of daisies, Helen's favorite, on the headstone. The granite had weathered a little, but her name was still clear. He stood in silence for a long moment. "You'd like him better now," he said finally, voice trembling. Ethan chuckled softly, eyes glistening. "I'm trying, Mom." The wind carried the scent of pine through the air. For a moment, the world felt perfectly still. Ethan reached out, steadying his father as they turned to leave. George didn't pull away. Back at the cabin that evening, Ethan repaired a loose gutter while George sat on the porch watching. The sunset washed the sky in amber and rose. "You know," Ethan said, hammering the last nail, "you could always sell this place, move closer to the city. Be easier for me to check on you." George chuckled. "The mountains aren't ready to let me go yet." Ethan grinned. "You sure it's not the other way around? Maybe." When the work was done, they sat side by side, 2 silhouettes framed by the last light of day. Neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy or sharp anymore. It was full, gentle, alive. A family of geese passed overhead, wings slicing through the sunset. The fire crackled faintly inside, waiting to be lit. George leaned back, sighing. "Your mother would have loved this. I think she'd just be glad we stopped yelling," Ethan said with a laugh. George smiled. That too. The sky dimmed to blue, then black. Stars began to appear faint at first, then brighter, scattered like promises across the dark. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was home. The meadow outside the cabin shimmered under the summer sun. The snow had long melted, replaced by a carpet of green grass and tiny yellow wildflowers that nodded gently in the breeze. The air was warm, filled with the distant murmur of bees and the rush of water from the creek below. George sat on the porch, his cane propped against the railing, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand. His hips still ached sometimes, but he was walking better now. There was color in his cheeks again, a quiet strength in his movements. Ethan's car pulled into the gravel drive just as George finished his tea. Hayden burst from the back seat, waving a stick like a sword. Grandpa, we're here, George chuckled, setting his glass down. I can see that. You nearly scared the birds off, soldier. Ethan climbed out, smiling. He's been talking about this all week. I'd be worried if he hadn't. George said, his eyes softening. Come here, you little rascal. Hayden ran up the porch steps, nearly tripping in his excitement. George knelt down as best he could and let the boy crash into his arms. It was a small, fierce hug, one that filled the hollow places left by years of silence. The cabin buzzed with life again. Ethan carried bags inside while Hayden explored every corner, marveling at the collection of old books, the creaky floorboards, and the smell of pine that never seemed to leave. George watched them both, smiling to himself. The house had always been full of echoes, but now the echoes were joined by laughter. After lunch, Hayden discovered the old wooden airplane resting on the shelf above George's desk. Its wings were chipped, the paint faded. Did you make this, Grandpa? A long time ago, George said, leaning back in his chair. Your dad and I used to fly it in the yard. Broke the wing on that very first day, didn't we, Ethan? Ethan grinned, remembering. Yeah, you told me to fix it myself. I was mad for days, and you did fix it, George replied, his eyes twinkling. Didn't last long, but you tried. That's what counts. Hayden examined the plane carefully, running a finger over the splintered edge. Can I fix it too? George's chest swelled with something tender. You can try. Just promise you won't give up when it gets tricky. The boy nodded with all the determination of a 9-year-old on a mission. Ethan handed him some glue and sandpaper, and the three of them sat together at the table, 3 generations, connected by an old toy, the air thick with sawdust and sunlight. Later that evening, the repaired plane sat proudly on the mantelpiece. The wing was uneven, but George swore it looked perfect. Hayden fell asleep on the couch, soon after his head in his father's lap. The cabin was quiet again, except for the sound of crickets outside. Ethan broke the silence. You ever think about leaving this place? George looked around the room, the photos, the wood stove, Helen's favorite chair. Every winter, he said. But every spring, I remember why I stay. Ethan nodded, staring into the dim glow of the fire. I get it now. The stillness here. It's different. I used to think it was loneliness. Maybe it's just peace. George smiled faintly. They're not that different, you know. Peace just hurts less. They sat like that for a long time, the light flickering across their faces. The next morning, Ethan suggested they drive down to the lake, the same one George used to visit with Helen. The air smelled of pine needles and warm water. The surface of the lake was smooth as glass, reflecting the sky like a mirror. They brought fishing poles, but never used them. After a while, Ethan spoke. Do you ever regret anything, Dad? George chuckled softly. Every day. But regrets don't grow you. They just tell you where you tripped last time. Ethan nodded. I wish we hadn't wasted so many years. George sighed. We didn't waste them. We just took the long road home." The words hung in the air, gentle and true. Ethan glanced at his father, eyes glistening. "I missed this," he said quietly. "So did I," George replied. "More than you'll ever know." They stayed there until the sun began to dip, turning the sky orange and pink. The mountains mirrored in the water, endless and steady. That evening, after Hayden went to bed, George sat at his desk with a sheet of paper in front of him. His handwriting was slower now, but every stroke carried purpose. "Dear Hayden, one day you'll grow up and wonder who you are. Don't make the same mistake I did thinking love has to be earned. It's already yours. All you have to do is keep it alive. Be patient with the people you love, even when they don't deserve it. Especially then. Your old man and I took too long to learn that. Maybe you'll do better. Grandpa." He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the repaired airplane on the shelf. Ethan found him there a few minutes later, looking out the window at the night sky. "Writing again?" he asked. "Just finishing something," George said. "Not everything has to stay unsaid anymore." Ethan smiled softly. "You've changed," George shrugged. "Or maybe I just ran out of reasons not to." The next morning, Ethan packed the car while Hayden ran circles around the yard, holding the plane above his head. "Look, Grandpa." "It still flies," George laughed, clapping. "Looks like it does, champ." Ethan came over, resting a hand on his father's shoulder. "We'll be back next weekend. The boy wants to camp by the lake." "You'd better," George said. "Bring more marshmallows this time." They both laughed. As the car disappeared down the road, George stayed on the porch, watching until it was gone. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only the rustle of wind through the trees. He wasn't lonely anymore. The quiet around him felt alive, full of memories and promises still waiting to be kept. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the horizon, where the sun dipped low behind the mountains. Helen's wind chime tinkled softly beside the door. A gentle voice carried on the air. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about rewriting the past. Maybe it was about giving the future a chance to begin again. He smiled, breathing in the scent of pine and warm earth. Somewhere behind him, the clock ticked like a heartbeat. The cabin, once a monument to silence, now pulsed with life. And if anyone had been there to ask him what he'd learned, he might have said this, that pride is heavy, but forgiveness is light. That love doesn't vanish when it's ignored. It waits quietly for courage to open the door. The sun slipped fully behind the ridge, painting the sky in deep gold. George closed his eyes, the faint hum of crickets filling the air. The porch creaked gently beneath him, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt right. Maybe it's time, he thought, to let peace have the final word. If this story touched you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. Tell us about someone you've reconnected with or someone you still hope to. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories about love loss and second chances. Sometimes the quietest endings carry the loudest truths.